That was Neil Young from the Bob Dylan 30th anniversary show that they did a number of years ago. I think that was like 50 years ago already. We also did hear Bob Dylan doing Tangled Up in Blue in New York outtake. And yes, folks, oh no, he's gone now. I was just about to say we have conquered the technology gods and we have Noe. We do have Noe. All right, we have him back. Believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, we do have the founder of Guitar World magazine and man about town, Noe Gold, live by remote in the studio. Noe, welcome to the show. Thank you for taking time out and having the patience to resolve all these challenges. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Andy, my main man.
How are you? It's great to see you. It's great to be able to see you and to talk to you.
I hope those people out there don't see me. This is a radio show, isn't it?
You know, one of the things, you're one of those people I'm so envious of because you grew up in a time that was absolutely magical for music and in a place that was magical for music, which is New York City. I mean, your childhood and your comeuppance was during that golden period of music in New York City. Talk about that a little bit.
Oh yeah, I'll tell you all about it. But first, I want to tell you that my story, part one of my story, just dropped on a website called headmagazine.com. And I know that you know what that is, Andy.
I do.
Because you're ahead from way back. And but enough about that. Enough about me. Actually, more about me.
Yeah, so, that's what we're here for. We're here to talk about you.
That's right. So here's the thing. My childhood began in, New York City has 5 boroughs. So Greenwich Village, which is what you're talking about, which is the hotbed of what was then known as the folk music movement, which was personified by all kinds of pre-hippies. They were not hippies at that time. They were beatniks and folkies, and they congregated in a place called Washington Square Park. It was well known throughout the world as a seat of Greenwich Village. It had this arch that was reminiscent of the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. And that arch overlooked this sprawling scene of folkies. That's how I can put it. There were people with bluegrass bands on one side. There was a jug band unit over here, a guy playing a mandolin, people playing harmonicas and whatnot, like me. And so in that crowd, as sure as clockwork, there was always especially on Saturdays, my old college buddy, may he rest in peace, his name was Artie Traum. And Artie was part of a combo called Happy and Artie Traum, the Traum brothers. In fact, if you look it up, they appeared on Bob Dylan's Greatest Hits, Part 2. They were kind of my sort of entree into this whole world. We went to City College in New York, and City College also was a hotbed of this social movement, which was overlapping with the anti-war movement. Not quite yet the hippie generation, but so that was the atmosphere. And but I grew up in the Bronx, New York, up on the Grand Concourse, and in my parents' third floor walk-up apartment, I had this thing called a Victrola. And Victrola,
it's a record player. For those that don't know, a Victrola is a record player.
There you go. And on that Victrola, I would play Well, for one thing, Bob Dylan's records and Paul Butterfield records and Sonny Boy Williamson, all these harmonica greats, and that's how I started to get into the harmonica, which I am a harmonica player. So the weird thing is, so I used to play. I went to school by subway from the Bronx to the Lower East Side of Manhattan, the Lower East Side, and I went to a parochial school on the Lower East Side. And when we used to play hooky, we hopped on the subway from the East Broadway station, 2 stops up to West 4th Street, got out in West 4th Street. And West 4th Street was this whole nother universe. And when we exited the subway, we went down the street called McDougal Street. Now, McDougal Street is where all these folk clubs existed. And the main hangout of that street, McDougal Street, was a place called the Gaslight Cafe. Now, the Gaslight Cafe, if you follow, there was a movie recently about the whole scene at the Gaslight Cafe with what's his name, Oscar Isaac. And
I played a couple songs from the Gaslight from when Dylan was there in '63, I think it was '62 or '63.
Okay, so in that place, in that cavernous space, yours truly, Dr. No, was in there every Tuesday night for an event called Dave Van Ronk's Hootenanny Night. And in that place, that was the first time I actually rubbed up against Bob Dylan, because Bob used to come there all the time. He was like canoodle with the waitresses and, crack wise with all these amazing people there, such as Jack Elliott, the Brooklyn Cowboy. He was there all the time. Richie Havens was there all the time. And somebody who I got to know very well, his name is Johnny Hammond Jr. So Johnny Hammond Jr. is the son of John Hammond Sr., the guy who brought Billie Holiday to the stage. He produced some records with Robert Johnson. So this is a lineage. Now, Johnny Hammond, he had a little combo that he played at the Gaslight. I watched him there many times. And the combo, and this is interesting because there is a connection between Bob Dylan and Jimi Hendrix, which I will get to when we talk about All Along the Watchtower. But the weird thing is, a catty corner across the street from the Gaslight was another club called the Cafe Wha, W-H-A ? And a Cafe Wha was what they used to call a basket house, because physically the performers at the Cafe Wha were not paid for their services, but they worked for tips, so to speak. So they passed the basket around, so to speak. And somebody who was there a lot and who I later got to know in those days is a guy named James Marshall Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix performed at the Cafe Wha on a regular basis. So Johnny Hammond Jr. got together with Jimmy, and he had a combo called Jimmy James and the Blue Flames.
Right.
Okay. So you got to keep me from drifting down into the.
Well, because it's an interesting story, because it's all connected. I mean, that kind of mecca of music is all connected, where everybody was within yards of each other playing on any given night. So when you wander into all these different places, it's fascinating to hear how you can go across the street from the Gaslight and go and see Jimi Hendrix playing with John Hammond, who was a keyboard player, right?
Johnny Hammond. No, John Hammond was and still is a guitar player. He
Okay.
made a number of records that were homages to Robert Johnson, and he was a deep blues guy, you know.
Right.
And the weird thing is that they also performed at a place down the street called the Cafe A Go Go. Cafe A Go Go was a slightly larger place than the Gaslight. But the weird thing is that, and this is where the history comes in. It was a place where groups like the Blues Project performed there regularly. I saw Muddy Waters there. I had an interesting tete-a-tete with Muddy Waters' piano player where I said, I had my harmonica out, and I said, you know, this instrument here, I could put it in my pocket. So the bass player says, well, that piano player there, he could put you in his pocket. So, but at the Cafe A Go Go, there was a gig with Johnny Hammond, Jimmy James and the Blue Flames, as they called it. And lo and behold, and this is history, you could look it up, there was a visit to that gig that night by a guy from the Animals named Chaz Chandler. Chaz Chandler, the bassist of the Animals,
right,
had heard about Jimi Hendrix, coincidentally via Keith Richards' girlfriend. That's another story. Keith Richards' girlfriend was the one who got Jimmy that gig at the Cafe A Go Go. Anyway, in the audience was Chaz Chandler, and he was digging it. And it was mind-boggling to me to be in the middle of all that and watch Jimmy perform. My memory of it was that Jimmy was like an encapsulation of Muddy Waters, but on a vertical level. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
when you think about Jimmy, you think about Jimmy sprawling all over the stage, you know, and roaming around. But in this tight space, he was shooting his music up to the sky,
right,
so to speak. He was
more directed,
right?
Yeah,
Very animated. Anyway, so that was going on, and what happened after that was Chaz went over to Jimmy, and however they did it, and he said, I'm going to take you over to England, and we're going to build this whole thing about you. And that was the origin of the Jimi Hendrix Experience. So
right. So I wanted to get you back on Bob Dylan. So during that time, you were at the iconic shows where Bob went from acoustic Bob to electric Bob. You were actually at that show that has become a mythical, show in the annals of time. And there's all kinds of conflicting reports that people booed him because he switched to electric. And your take on that as one who was actually there is a little bit different. Talk about that. Talk about that actual show.
Beautiful. I'm glad you asked, because I'm looking at my story here in headmagazine.com, and in fact, there is it opens up with a section called Dylan Goes Electric, Controversy at Newport. So let me read you a little bit from my piece, because that explains it better than I could extemporaneously. All right, so here's what I said. The next musical milestone in my life was the Newport Folk Festival in the summer of '65. Working as a counselor in a summer camp in the Catskills, I jumped into an old Oldsmobile jalopy that I had acquired, and my ragtag crew made the journey through the sweltering Catskill Mountains to the Mecca of folky renaissance that was happening in Rhode Island, Newport, Rhode Island. So after some adjustment to the new terrain, thousands of music-loving folkies with their backpacks and vagabond gear marching up the hill to a hallowed stage where soundcheck was just concluding, my pal Jerry Seidenfeld from the Bronx and I joined the raging multitudes. I'm sorry, the ragtag multitudes as we trudged up. They weren't raging yet to higher ground. So then, as we got closer to the performance area, I heard something very familiar to me, and that was the sounds of the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, which I had listened to on my Victrola over and over again.
Right.
So it was unmistakable. So what happened there was that Bob recruited the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, minus Paul Butterfield for that gig, to be his backup band at the Newport Folk Festival. So the controversy, here's where the controversy occurred. So Bob is up there, and you gotta think about this. The folk music, I don't want to say hierarchy, but the leading lights of the folk music movement, personified by a guy named Pete Seeger. Pete Seeger was sort of the godfather of that whole thing.
Right.
And before him, Woody Guthrie, which was the reason that Bob Dylan came to New York in the first place. He went from Hibbing, Minnesota to New York so he could go visit Woody Guthrie, who was in a nursing home in New Jersey. So there's that connection there. But so here's the Newport Folk Festival, this hallowed ground, which Dylan had appeared at in 1964, 1963, for a couple of years running,
right,
leading up to this event. But this time, he's up there with a Fender Stratocaster and a big blues band behind him, and they're wailing. You had Al Cooper on the keyboards.
Right.
That's Cooper with a K. So then there was a big ruckus. You heard a lot of yelling. That's where the controversy comes in, because some people say they were booing Bob Dylan.
Right.
Others, like myself, said no, they were going down in front, because I was sort of in the rear and I couldn't see what was going on because everybody was standing up in front of me. You know? So back to where I was, we were going down in front. Then later there was rumors or stories about how somebody said that Pete Seeger had actually pulled the plug on Bob's Stratocaster because he was upset that he was doing this electric stuff.
Right.
So there's all that. Pete later walked that back, and he said, "No, I've always supported Bob, whatever he does." So that's clear. But,
right.
You know, so
now we fast forward from that event, and somehow you end up renting a room in Bob's house in Woodstock.
Yeah.
Okay. How did you go from that show, and now all of a sudden you're living in Bob's house and answering the phone when Bob calls?
Well, it's a couple of years later after that fact, and in the interim, I went up to Canada to be a teaching assistant at a school in Toronto. Then, rather than get my master's and become an English literature professor, which was my career path at that time, I said, "Nah, I'm into Jack Kerouac. Let me do what Jack would do." Jack would ride a freight train. So that's what I did. Me and my girlfriend at the time. And now this is 1969, the summer of the Woodstock Festival. Okay. Now, the Woodstock Festival did not take place in Woodstock, New York. It took place a few miles over in the Catskills in what was known as the Borscht Belt, because of all the Jewish comedians that
Right.
performed up there,
Yeah.
right? In Grossinger's, New York, and whatnot. So the actual Woodstock Festival was in Liberty, New York, where I used to go as a kid with my parents to these bungalow colonies. So there's that. That's my connection to it, to that area. But so at the time of the Woodstock Festival, which was not in Woodstock, so me and my girlfriend Carol, we were on a freight train riding out to British Columbia, and we used to joke about how those hippies can have the Woodstock Festival. We have the real Woodstock going on right here. It's in real life. So we got to the end of our journey, came back, and I got out of the draft. I did not have to go to Vietnam, and I wound up in Woodstock, New York, with my college roommate Mickey Friedman, and we rented this cabin on top of a hill. And what I was doing, I was actually a hippie by then. I was making a thing called sand candles. Okay, so what is a sand
I remember
candle?
sand candles.
Right?
I remember sand candles.
You take a cardboard box, you fill it up with sand, you make an impression in the sand, and then you pour hot wax into that mold, as it were. Yeah. But during that time, because of my connection with my friend Artie Traum, who was Artie and Happy Traum, they were sort of the resident I don't want to say house band, because there were a lot of house bands up there in Woodstock at the time. But we used to play at this club called the Elephant Cafe on Rock City Road. And I was jamming with people like, Artie and Happy, and this guy named Eric Kaz, a lot of leading lights. And ultimately, there was another guy who was an icon of the bluegrass music movement. His name was Johnny Harold. So Johnny Harold was a weird guy, but a good guy. I used to go up to his house. This is before I lived in Dylan's house. I used to go up to Johnny's house. Johnny was a mushroom collector. Okay, so we would go around looking for mushrooms. I wind up back in his house, and I would jam with people that showed up. In fact, one of the people that showed up at Johnny's house was an Irish gentleman named Van Morrison. I got to jam with Van. So that was a big milestone in my life. Okay, so now you're wondering, how does that get me into Bob Dylan's house? Well,
that was going to be my question.
So after a few nights of this carousing that we would do at the Elephant and the Joyous Lake, various like watering holes in Woodstock, Mickey and I come back to our cabin, and there's all these fire engines up there. So basically what happened was something went wrong with one of my torches for melting the wax or something, burned the friggin' house down.
Wow.
So here I am. What am I going to do? So my good friend Artie Traum, who happened to be house sitting for Bob at his house in Birdcliff, on Birdcliff Road, Artie says, okay, you and Mickey, come and live with me. You guys can occupy a couple of the guest rooms here. It was a 20-room house. And
so there was room.
Yeah, right? There was room for us. So 20-room house had about, I don't know, 4 or 5 bathrooms and whatnot. It was a wonderful, wonderful piece of property. Bob had left. You might know about the infamous motorcycle accident that he had. He was cooling his heels. He moved down to Greenwich Village, and so that's where he was. And so I was free to roam. And the weird thing was that, this whole thing about Woodstock at the Woodstock Festival versus the real Woodstock, I was constantly walking out the front porch, and I was seeing. I remember this like it was yesterday. Seeing this kid with his backpack, and he's standing out front in the snow. He's looking for the Woodstock Festival.
He didn't know it was in August.
Exactly. Well, people got messed up in a lot of different ways in those days.
So now, is there going to be a follow-up article that's going to be in Head Magazine?
Yes, this the article that you can see now on headmagazine.com. It's called, and I'm looking for the headline. It's called Bob Dylan Bringing It All Back Home, Part 1. Now, Part 2 is set to arrive. I'm working on finishing touches of it now. Should be launching in time for Bob's appearance here in Los Angeles at the Pantages Theater.
Okay. He's going to be here in Eugene, June 5th, I think.
Yeah, he's going to be in Los Angeles about a week later. And I'm going to be writing about that performance in headmagazine.com. And but the weird thing is, Bob has always been kind of in my consciousness. What's amazing about him is, and I think he had a song about it in his last double album, I Contain Multitudes. That was his song. And I don't think he was talking about himself. I think he was talking about a higher being, But Bob contains multitudes. He has roots in the Woody Guthrie side of things, the countryside. He did an album when I was living in Woodstock, and I'm looking at the cover of it, Nashville Skyline.
Right.
Nashville Skyline, I'm looking at his smiling face here. He's holding a Gibson acoustic guitar. He's looking down at the camera. And Elliot Landy, who took this picture for this cover, he also has many stories about Bob and how playful he is and how playful he always was. So I'm rambling on. So
no, that's a good one to end on. So I have I Contain Multitudes queued up, but that's a good song to go out on.
All right.
So Noe, thank you so much for coming on the show. Everybody go to headmagazine.com and find the article. It is a great rebirth of an old magazine. We're going to have Charlotte Parker on probably in the coming weeks and talk about Head Magazine and how she's kind of rebirthed it.
All right. So before you go, are you going to go to that track? Before you go, I just want to say one thing. There was a little cabin on the property, and it had a pool hall. Not a pool hall. It had a pool table. A pool table in the cabin. And there's pictures of Bob and George Harrison leaning out the window where I shot pool. And so I just want to say that I hit a lot of straight eights in 8-ball, and we played 9-ball there too. So.
Thanks, Noe. It's been great talking to you. I appreciate you coming on the show.
All right, buddy.
I'll see ya. Okay.